Fantasy is a genre that is easy to get into as a writer, but often has mixed results for readers. There's often a discrepancy in what writers get out of writing fantasy and what readers take away from the book as they read it. I've heard a ton of cool ideas that are really interesting from fellow writers for fantasy stories, but I also know that a lot of writers will struggle with publishing fantasy and may experience a whirlwind of mixed results depending on the work they publish, as far as audience response goes. Publishing a novel can be scary when you know you have ideas that people would love, but you have a lot of worry about doing too much or too little in as far as lore dumps, world building, magic systems, etc. all go. As a rabid fantasy enthusiast, I have read and written plenty of fantasy. I've also taken a lot of literary classes by published authors in my time about fantasy and storytelling. If you're interested in writing fantasy but want to make sure you're making the best quality story you can, my fantasy video series, of which this video is the first, may be just what you need to get going. Keep in mind this is an opinion piece, but I will try to provide some research, other opinions, and a whole lot of perspectives out there with resources in the description. Hello, I'm Connor Barlow, and welcome to the Book Bin, or welcome back if you're a returning guest. In this video, I plan to begin with the most basic foundation of fantasy and how this foundation should always be kept in focus whenever you write. Folklore and myth, the origin and father of the modern fantasy genre. By learning more about this connection and its impact on modern fantasy, as well as why you can never do enough research on folklore, you will find it a lot easier to write what you want to write while keeping your audience in mind. Before we dive in, let's make sure we're all operating with the same understanding of what folklore, myth, and fantasy are, as each are related but distinctive. While these differences may seem obvious to any writer, I believe many new writers struggle to know how to use the connections between them. I've wondered before how many writers even think about that connection while working on a project. And I think many of you can think of a book, movie, show, game, or any other piece of media where you go in thinking they have a certain folklore concept, then find out that it's entirely different from what you expected. A good example off the top of my head is Twilight, but I'll try to remember to bring that up later. I don't plan to just read you the Oxford Dictionary on folklore, myth, or fantasy as though that's the exclusive definition, but I do plan to establish what my understanding of these topics are, so we're all on the same page. I'd encourage you after watching this video to take the time to study these topics yourself as well, and I will again provide a few resources I used to make this video in a link in the description. With all that said, let's get started. First, what do I mean when I say folklore? Folklore refers to adventures, artifacts, people, creatures, and locations from stories told within a specific cultural context. All cultures have their own folklore, and many neighboring cultures will have shared folklore, though with their own flavors and stories. For example, the Pari is a folklore creature from Iran. I apologize if I pronounce anything incorrectly during this time, by the way. Pari are beautiful, winged beings and are heavily tied to Iranian supernatural beliefs. The Pari were once seen as more demonic, but over time became more neutral and complex, being capable of good and evil. Pari also exist in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey, all neighboring cultures that have adopted the Pari and have their own interpretations and nuances based on their own social customs, traditions, and cultures. Essentially, whenever you hear me talk about folklore, I'm focused on folk tales that discuss creatures, people, stories, places, all seated in a specific cultural context. When I refer to myths, I'm referring to stories that explain cosmological or supernatural traditions of a group of people. These stories explain a culture's gods, heroes, traditions, religious beliefs, and more. Many cultures across the globe have strong myth heritage in poetry and storytelling. Those myths can often inform you about norms, beliefs, philosophies, and even taboos, fears, and omens. These are also very different across cultures, though some may have overlap, especially if two or more cultures, again, are in close proximity. Finally, let's define fantasy. When I mention fantasy, I'm referring to the literary and storytelling genre in which imaginary elements are real in the story's context. There's often magical or supernatural elements, alternate worlds, heroes, creatures, all of which that cannot be found in our real world. There can also be elements that defy the laws of the natural world that we live in. These worlds provide readers and writers an ecosystem for a unique story that could not take place in our own world. Now, there are subgenres like urban fantasy that do take place in our world, but there is still an element of defying reality for those fantasies to exist. But again, that's a specific small facet that we won't be really going over in this video. Essentially, just keep this in mind. We're focused on the unreal aspects that are required in a fantasy to make it a fantasy. Now that we've defined folklore, myth, and fantasy, let's quickly discuss how they tie together. Folklore has existed pretty much since forever. There's almost zero human civilizations that didn't have some kind of storytelling in play. Oral storytelling was the dominant tradition for thousands of years, and recently, in human history, writing and keeping physical records of stories have helped to preserve them. Essentially, folklore and storytelling are deeply interwoven for as long as humans could speak. By extension, myth has existed and been preserved in storytelling, religious rites, and entertainment in many cultures for just as long. Myth and folklore are vital for the following reasons: social cohesion, child development, and cultural heritage. These stories are taught at a young age for essentially all of these purposes: to encourage creativity, shared language, and cultural strength and identity, as well as to teach lessons, communicate empathy, and learn emotional self-awareness. Folklore and myth are integral to communities' betterment and development, and is a commonality people can share creatively while still understanding each other. You may be thinking, this is cool info, Kano, but so what? Why do I need to know this? What does this have to do with fantasy? These questions may feel especially relevant if your target audience is teens or adults. Well, folklore is seen as the origin of the fantasy genre as we know it, and folklore and myth are the grandfathers of fantasy, or fathers of fantasy. Some of the first published fantasy books are considered the Brothers Grimm collection of folk tales, or the collection of Swedish-inspired tales by Hans Christian Andersen. On top of that, many of the biggest names to establish the modern fantasy genre are names like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, who were heavily inspired by both folklore and myth in their creative and academic literary fields, and they're not the only ones. An additional secret thing you may want to keep in mind as a writer is that by using folklore and myth, you don't have to explain things as much. This is kind of a secret hack that can be very useful. If you entirely invent a new culture with its own lore and rules, you have to make sure the reader knows all that they need to know about it, which can be difficult without overly intrusive lore dumps. By using folklore, you can skip explanations about why a dragon can breathe fire, because readers in Western European cultures typically understand that dragons breathe fire. To this day, folklore has a deep connection and influence to our modern fantasy books. And as an author, you should consider this importance and how many great works of fantasy utilize this connection to better that work, which is what we'll discuss next: how to leverage people's understanding of folklore and myth in your own work, with examples to help you get started. To best teach you how to leverage folklore knowledge in your fantasy work, let's work off an example. I picked two examples for this video, one that's pretty well established, and one that is also well established but has some complicated factors when considering research. We'll go through the former example first. So, let's talk about the Fae. Let's say you want to write a fantasy story that focuses predominantly on the Fae. Where should you start? Do you just start by writing, outlining, world building, trying to establish a group of people you'll call the Fae? Well, I wouldn't recommend starting with any of those. Instead, I'd start with researching the Fae. Who are the Fae? What are their key traits? Why are they called Fae? Here's a good starting resource. According to the Peculiar Brunette, who has multiple sources at the bottom of this article, the Fae are spirits of nature, or tricksters that can be violent and operate outside of a good and evil axis. Fae and fairy are often used interchangeably, but that's also up for debate among scholars. Some of the key traits of the Fae are their moral neutrality, being prone to both evil and good, their trickster proclivities, and their connection to nature itself. You'll commonly see terms like Seelie and Unseelie courts, which are the groups that Fae may belong to. Seelie comes from the word Zelig, which means blessed. Seelie courts are typically bright, cheerful, and welcoming to others, often willing to help, while the Unseelie are cruel, unkind, and wicked. Neither group operates on a good-evil axis. However, both can do harm or good for humanity, depending on what they're doing. The Fae also have a lot of power in names. Their own name might be tied to their magic, and they might be able to have power over others when they learn the person's name. Additionally, Fae are not very trusting of humans, and they'll often demand a lot of respect and subservience, which they take very seriously, and they do not take kindly to slights. Types of Fae include banshees, elves, gnomes, mermaids, nymphs, pixies, selkies, undines, and will-o'-the-wisps, among many others, each with their own unique traits outside of what was listed previously. Where do the Fae come from? Well, the predominant culture tied to the Fae include the English and the Irish. Some scholars believe that the Fae themselves are based around the original populations in this region, small people who lived in mounds and hills that were forced to the outskirts of the islands to make way for colonizers and settlers. There are also mythological origins, such as being a new interpretation of the Mediterranean demons and the Central Asian jinnis. We don't know for sure. There may also be many other proposed origins for the Fae's existence in both folklore and culture. There are depictions also of the Fae in other parts of Europe as well that may be worth looking up and researching, each with their own unique origin. While looking up some Fae, I decided to use Wikipedia to find a few examples of stories to read. Disclaimer: Wikipedia is a great place to start researching, as they provide a lot of sources that you can read on, and it usually gives a good high-level overview of a topic, and it is generally accurate. However, you should not base all of your knowledge off Wikipedia, as it can have gaps, errors, sometimes even misinformation. But with that said, the Wikipedia article can point you to a few stories to look up and read, such as Sir Orfeo, The Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, and many of the Brothers Grimm collection of tales. On that note, fairy tales in general are, by name, associated with the Fae, though not all have a literal Fae appearance in the story. But that may lead you to read works on fairy tales, and maybe something like The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, or so on. There are Fae who appear in Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella as well, for example. Okay, that was a lot of information, but if you take the time to do this, you'll be able to do this next part very well. As we continue, we'll just use the information I listed here before. It should be enough to at least get you an idea of what we're looking for. Your next step is to identify the common traits, values, attitudes, and habits that the Fae have or represent that you have determined are integral to what makes the Fae what they are. These will be the traits that you need to keep in mind for your story. For the sake of time, let's say we identified that Fae are morally neutral, prone to both good and evil. There's power in names. They operate in courts that can be positive or negative. They're reclusive, and they demand respect. With that, you now have a list of traits you know the Fae will need in your story so that they will be identifiable to your reader. The reason you want to do this is because when you say the word Fae, your reader will begin your story with a preconceived idea that has a strong, established cultural identity. And if you wander too far from this, they may be frustrated at why you called them Fae at all. Think again to Twilight and the vampire drama that happened for years when they started sparkling, and people were a little thrown off by that. Additionally, you can skip explanations for why your Fae behave a certain way, because it is already culturally established and learned by many readers in your target audience. You can then use this list alongside your outline or rough draft to make sure your Fae stay consistent. But you can also look at where you want to break these established traits in your story to make your Fae unique. What I mean by this is, if you know what Fae are and how they work, you can decide to take a specific trait or characteristic and change it to something that fits your story and narrative, one that doesn't conflict with other characteristics and make the Fae unique to your story. Breaking rules works better when you know what the rules are and why they were there in the first place. So take the time to research your subject before you break any rules. This entire example can be boiled down into these steps. First, identify what folklore element appears in your work. Second, research its common traits, its origins, and research examples of it used in previous works and stories. Third, make a list of key traits based on your research that you know you need to implement. Fourth, and optional, is identify what traits on that list you wish to alter to make it unique. Be thoughtful. Only pick what you know needs to change to fit your story, rather than making changes just to try to be different. This structure works very well for pretty much any folklore element, but there may be some complications you run into. Let's quick go over an example of a more complex folk element and talk about how to tackle that. Off the bat, there's one creature that I can think of that has a pretty complicated issue going with it when it comes to research. That's the vampire. When you hear the word vampire, you're probably thinking of a being that drinks blood, is only out at night, cannot see its reflection in a mirror, and maybe other elements like transforming into a bat or smoke, hypnotism powers, and more. This is the classic vampire that many people are familiar with, but it's not actually the original vampire. Originally, vampires were actually a folklore monster in Central and Eastern European cultures, and were actually more similar to what we know today as zombies. They were brought back from the dead and would kill and devour the living, often hunting wildly, and were just as likely to attack animals as they would people. Some stories had these vampires hunting their own family members for not protecting them from being raised from the dead, but most are mindless. The classic vampire you and I know of today can be traced to a few different places, but many believe there are two stories that really made the modern vampire what it is now: John William Polidori's The Vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula. The latter is especially known as the most iconic depiction of the vampire, and nearly all modern vampire depictions are based on this. What does this mean for our research? What do you do when a folklore creature has two very different perspectives? My advice would be to research the modern version more heavily, but don't leave out the original. The reason you want to research the modern version more is because this is the version that most readers will be familiar with, and so you want to understand those conventions and make that same list of key traits based on that. The value of researching the original version, however, is for the same reason you want to make alterations to those key traits to make your work unique. A lot of people don't know about the original folklore anymore, and there may be really interesting opportunities to bring back some of that and give that homage and respect to the cultures that originally provided this creature for you to write about. To quickly insert my own example, I have a project currently on the shelf in the same world as my developer in Spain, but with a vampire instead of a werewolf. Instead of the classic, my idea is that the vampire is an undead, decaying person who can reverse the decay by consuming the hearts of living people. Instead of a bat motif, the vampire has a butterfly motif, as I researched animals that drink blood and found that there is a type of butterfly that drinks blood. I also chose the butterfly because some cultures in the same regions believe that butterflies carry people's souls to the afterlife, and so the butterflies around this vampire will carry the souls of his victims, though it's not clear if this is real or in his own mind. I share this because I hope it can help you figure out things you want to do, and give you ideas of things to research, and how it can be very beneficial to research folklore subjects so you can better shape your own work. Before we conclude, let's quickly touch on how to leverage myth in your work as well. This is going to be similar to folklore, but I wanted to discuss myth tales a bit as well on their own. Myths are just as valuable as folklore, but might be a little more difficult to leverage in your writing. Not impossible, just a greater challenge. By researching myths and stories in many cultures, You can get a glimpse into their cultural and religious beliefs and can make references to stories or figures in mythology that others will be able to draw on, as well as you can still use myth creatures, artifacts, etc. However, usually this is a more indirect reference than folklore if you're focused on the tales, and you're instead drawing on ideas, illusions, and making a metaphorical connection to something the reader may be familiar with, and will identify key themes and implications when they notice the implicit connection. For example, let's examine Greek mythology, and in a moment we will specifically examine Dionysus. In general, Greek myths will often highlight something about the deities of the Greek pantheon, as most creatures, places, and people have a tie to one of the gods in some ways. Common traits to Greek mythology include the gods' capability of both good and evil and their fickle nature, heroes who perform impossible feats of physical or mental prowess while having unique vulnerabilities and weaknesses, as well as magical tools and unique monsters. When Greek myths are told, the audience reading or listening is meant to take away a moral lesson about their own behavior, an understanding of their culture, or a new perspective on their patron god or the world itself. For example, let's talk about the Greek tragedy Bacchae by playwright Euripides. I might be pronouncing Bacchae wrong. We'll find out. Maybe. This is an incredibly famous play that focuses on Dionysus. The quick version is that Dionysus returns to Thebes to make himself known and establish one of his own cults there, but the leaders of Thebes, named Pentheus, and alongside with him is his mother Agave, they reject Dionysus, and the story itself is Dionysus enacting his revenge on them by driving them mad. Spoiler, but the play ends with Agave driven mad, killing Pentheus and parading his head on a pike, thinking she slayed a wild beast. I think maybe a lion, I don't remember, it's been a while. Many believe the lessons one should take from this story is that of self-control, control of others, and freedom. You need to have strong self-control and not do any mad thing you wish, as it can result in the harms of others, and that controlling others and preventing them from practicing their beliefs can lead to risk, to people being driven mad to seek what they wish, that people should be free to make decisions, as the lack of freedom breeds madness. How can you use a story like this? Well, perhaps you want to create a deity in your fantasy world that is a Dionysus-like figure, a god of madness and revelry, who can also be petty and ruin the lives of those who wrong him. Perhaps this god wants to make his presence known to a people he has rejected, and so he enacts vengeance by driving the people mad. Perhaps the madness is a tool to infiltrate the people, or your protagonists have to battle their own madness and practice self-control to succeed. You can use motifs or references to the Bacchae, such as a lion pelt or running off into the forest or mountains to revel, as ways to get readers thinking of the play to help strengthen messages and ideas you want to convey. I would recommend doing something similar as in the folklore section, but modified. Research where the myth comes from, what themes it has, and what key traits make the story recognizable or iconic. Then plan how you want to make allusions to it or draw comparisons, and make sure to implement that thoughtfully throughout your writing. Don't copy sections, don't quote directly, especially if the myth doesn't exist in your fantasy world. The exception would be if you're doing like an urban fantasy, or if there's some way that it can be referenced directly because it exists. Overall, just don't do anything too literal. Just keep it in the back of your mind as you write and let those ideas and themes seep through into the subtext. This is just one of many ways to use myth. Other examples include things similar to our exploration of folklore, such as perhaps reading myths about the Cyclops or the Centaur, two mythical creatures with their own established lore. But I just wanted to provide you with a few different structures and examples for how to approach research and implement your knowledge into your work. So to close out, in summary, remember this most of all. Folklore and myth are integral to fantasy, and by researching them, you make your own work easier for your readers to connect with and understand. Take the time to research folklore or myth origins and key traits, then identify how you can implement those things into your work. With them there, you won't need to lore dump as often, as the themes, traits, and ideas will be fairly known by readers and will be easy for them to digest and follow. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something. If you have any questions or if you'd like to share how folklore or myth have influenced your own writing, feel free to leave it down in the comments. Again, all my resources will be linked in the description. And finally, feel free to like, subscribe, hype, whatever it is you prefer, and I hope to see you back at the book bin in the future.